Okay, Passan, can you give me a thumbs up if it says what makes a good question on the screen? I'm not sure if that worked.
Yep.
Okay, super. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Mina, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the questions that you ask your students, so both written and spoken. Um, so, um, oops. Right. So just a bit about me first, and why this is important to me. So I am an examiner for a major exam board. So I actually write A-level exams. And part of my job is not just writing the exam, but also I kind of manage the marking of that exam. And then once the students have done the exam and it's been marked and we've set grade boundaries and everything, afterwards we analyze how effective each question was. And we actually do a bit of statistical analysis on that. This has actually really informed the rest of my teaching practice. So it's made me really understand the kinds of questions and how to phrase questions in a way that you can effectively assess the student's understanding. But conversely, I've also learned in the drafting processes ways of asking questions that are actually not helpful. So we're going to be looking at what is the purpose of asking the question in the first place? What are the consequences to your students if you don't ask the question well? Common pitfalls and how to avoid them, and I'll show you some practical examples. And then very briefly at the end, just because it's so interesting to me, I'm just going to very briefly touch on the scientific theory about how to analyze questions. But I'll signpost you to how to find out more on that, because I know that not everybody will be interested in that. So what are the main purposes of questioning? So I picked three main categories. So one of them is assessing your students. So this might be formative or summative. In other words, you're doing a test at the end of the topic and you just want to rank your students. That's summative assessment. Or there's formative, where you want to find out as you're going along how well they're understanding the topic that you're teaching. These kinds of questions can be written or spoken. So you could write your questions on a worksheet or on a test, or you could just ask your students in class. Another type of questioning is just for engagement. So you could be actually showing your students something really interesting, and then you might say something like, what do you think will happen next? Questions like this. I sometimes also call these rhetorical questions, because actually you don't always need an answer. You're just asking them questions to try and spark some interest and get them to keep listening to you. And then finally, the third kind of sort of academic question is a reinforcement. So just like Dr. Stimson was talking about in plenaries, often you would use these kind of questions in plenaries. This is where you're not actually assessing your students, you're just helping them memorize stuff that you think that they already know. So a bit like if they're doing an online quiz, you could just ask them, right, say primary, recite your times tables. You expect that they do actually know that times table. You're just giving them another chance to just practice doing it again. So that's reinforcement. Of course, there's a fourth type of questioning, which is sort of like disciplinary behavioral questioning. Like, what's going on here? What are you doing? And there is a right and wrong way of asking those questions as well, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. So I'm only going to be talking about academic questions. The main category of questioning that we're going to be looking at today is the assessment kind, because that's something that I'm particularly trained in. But we will also talk about engaging questions as well. Okay, so what are the consequences if you ask your question poorly? This is something I'm really passionate about. And when I've mentored inexperienced teachers before, trainee teachers, this is something that surprises me, that teachers often don't put a lot of thought into this kind of thing, but actually questioning is such a big part of our job, and we're doing it all the time throughout a lesson, and also when we write things like worksheets. So the main negative consequence if you don't ask your question well is that you will assess your students incorrectly. You will get the wrong idea of whether they understand the concept or not, and this can lead to ineffective intervention. So it can go both ways. You can feel like they understand this concept, and so you move on, but actually they don't understand. And it's that they've just guessed the correct answer, or your question was so vague, it wasn't actually helpful to find out whether or not they understand. Or conversely, you think that they don't understand because your question was unhelpful, and they've given you an answer that's a bit garbled. And so you carry on with that topic when actually your students are getting frustrated. Yes, we understood it. So that leads to ineffective intervention. And then the other flip side, and I touched on this just now when I talked about frustration, is that it can cause doubt in your students. So you can ask them a question and previously they thought they understood the concept, but because your question was so unhelpful or badly phrased, that's led them to think, oh, actually, I thought I understood, but I don't anymore. This can lead to low engagement with the subject. And I would actually propose that it's probably one of the #1 reasons why a student can become unengaged with a particular subject. It's because they were frustrated or confused or filled with doubt because of the questions that they were asked. It can also harm the student-teacher relationship, because if a student is frustrated in your lessons, it's just the way young people work, is that they tend to perceive that as something that's personally down to you. So, you know, for example, I teach physics. If I was asking ineffective questions, they wouldn't necessarily think, oh, physics is not for me, but they might think Miss Marsh is not for me. This can really harm the relationship. It can also reinforce misconceptions. So if you phrased a question badly and then rewarded their incorrect answer just because the question was so vague or and their answer was unclear, then they can go away thinking, oh yes, I've got it correct, when actually they haven't. And different types of poor questioning can really affect certain special educational needs more than others. This is something I'll touch on when we go through some examples. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you how important this is. So here's the first major pitfall to avoid when you are asking questions, and that is ambiguity. In other words, when a question has a double meaning, an unintended double meaning. So I've got an example on the board. And I know that lots of you perhaps don't teach in the English language, but I think all languages have these words with these double meanings, and you just have to be so careful not to use words like that in your questions. You have to be really mindful. So here's an example that an ex-colleague of mine wrote into a test at my last school. By what factor does the pressure of the gas increase? So this was really interesting when we came to mark it, because as all the physics teachers, we thought that's a perfectly reasonable question. But then to our amazement, some of our higher ability students that we just knew they were higher ability scored 0 on this question. So I'll give you a second to try and work out why they misunderstood the question. Okay, so it's because this word factor has a double meaning. So in English, the word factor can mean, like in maths, a ratio. And that is what we were looking for in this question. We wanted the kids to calculate a ratio. But it can also mean like contributing factor or causes. So, you know, what causes made the pressure increase. So this was a really badly phrased question, and it meant that lots of students didn't understand, and they didn't get full marks for this question, even though they did understand the concepts themselves. So a better question would have been, calculate the ratio by which the pressure increases. This is super clear that a number is required, a calculation is required, and then this would have prevented the high ability students from misunderstanding the question. Or if you wanted to ask the other question, describe the contributing factors or describe the causes that make the pressure increase. Cool, so just one more example on this point. So this is more like a spoken question that I see trainee teachers use this kind of question a lot. What is happening here? So imagine you're showing your kids, let's say, a video of a volcano erupting. What is happening here? You might ask your students. So this is probably in the engagement category of questions, but it's also a little bit you're trying to assess whether they're understanding what is happening here. The problem with this question seems so innocent, but it's really unclear whether the teacher wants a description of what can be observed. I am seeing, you know, hot rock and liquid come out of a mountain, or an explanation of the reasons behind it. So this is because of a buildup of gas pressure or something like that. Or even just a statement of the name of the phenomenon. It's a volcano eruption, done. So the problem with this is that actually some students can get quite frustrated if they guess incorrectly what question you're looking for. So I've seen, when I've observed teachers do this a lot. So the teacher will ask, what is happening here? And then a student will be like, oh, it's a volcano eruption. And they'll be like, yes, I know. Of course it's a volcano eruption, but you know, why is it happening? So you should have asked that in the first place. So a better question would be, describe what you can see here, describe your observations, and then they could talk about the hot lava or whatever, explain why this is happening, or just state the name of this phenomenon. So these would all have been better questions for that teacher to ask. I mentioned briefly before about special educational needs. In particular, students with, I have found, students with autistic spectrum disorder can get particularly frustrated by ambiguous questions. They tend to answer questions literally, and the teacher I've observed this many times, and then the teacher thinks that the student is being sarcastic or a smart aleck or something, when actually it's just that the question itself was ambiguous, had a double meaning. This can really harm the student-teacher relationship both ways. So please be really careful of this if it's not something that you've thought of before. Because I teach physics, just statistically, autistic spectrum disorder students are overrepresented in my subject. And so this is something that I've really come across a lot, and I've had to really be mindful of and work into my practice. So as a conclusion for that particular pitfall, the thing you want to do is use approved command words, question command words. So this touches a bit on the Bloom's taxonomy that Dr. Stimson mentioned in the last presentation. So if you start your question with one of these words, it makes it a lot clearer what you're looking for. So if you start the question with the word calculate, then your students know that you're looking for a numerical answer. It just helps prevent that ambiguity, that double meaning. On the other hand, sometimes I think teachers worry that it sounds a bit formal, describe this phenomenon, but questions can still be friendly and engaging, even though you're using the correct command words. So you can soften your question by, if it's a spoken one, by saying something like, can anyone calculate this for me? Can anyone describe this phenomenon? Would anybody like to volunteer to explain what is happening here? And then that can just soften the question, but still remain unambiguous. And I would say, I would rather be totally clear, even if that made me seem a little bit formal, rather than be informal, but then unclear. Cool, so the second pitfall, and this is particularly for written questions, and this is one of my first lessons as an exam writer, is to avoid having too much unnecessary information. So here's a picture of a real life, my very first draft of an exam from several years ago now. So this was, so there's like 7 drafting stages when you write an A-level exam, but this was the very first draft. Don't read it because you will grow old by the time you have finished reading it. It's much too long. I had unnecessary context. I told them a bit of a story. This was the final question. It was just a statement and then a question. So the conclusion there is, when you are questioning, you are not explaining something at the same time. Do not tell your students a story. Get them to tell you the story. Optimally, a question should just be one brief sentence long. Separate in your lesson when you are explaining something and when you are asking a question. If you ramble on as part of your question, students will have already lost focus about what you're trying to say. And then again, certain special educational needs. So students, for example, who if it's a written question, who have low reading processing speed, things like that, they can really sort of lose track of what's actually being asked of them, and you will get disproportionately poor responses from them. So that's the second pitfall to avoid. The third and final one that I want to talk about, which I don't have time to show you an example, but I have many examples of this, is when questions can be answered correctly by accident. So just a really brief example is if you're a maths teacher and you're asking 4 divided by 2. The answer is, of course, 2, but 4 subtract 2 is also 2. Also, 2 is just one of the numbers in the question. So actually some students could just, well, I'll just pick one of those numbers at random, 2, or I'll subtract them because I can't remember what division is. This is a really facetious example, and I have more sort of like A-level examples that I could show you another time. But the main thing is test out your questions first. This is particularly true if you haven't written a worksheet yourself, you've got it off the internet or something. If it's numerical questions, if you're a maths teacher or a science teacher, something like that, please try everything out and make sure it can't be answered accidentally in another way, in an incorrect way. When we write A-level exams, we actually have people who do this for us. They're called scrutineers and revisers, and they do our draft paper for us, and then they write a report. Also, if you're writing multiple choice questions, which I have to do as part of my exam work, if one of the options clearly stands out as different, so if you have something like this, all of the above, you will always get certain students who just always pick the odd one out, or you will get certain students who never pick the odd one out. So it's really important actually that your 4 options, try and match them a little bit. Don't have one that's much longer than the other, for example. Also, this seems really obvious, don't make all your answers A, all the correct answers, because there will be some students who just guess all A. You need a balance of A, B, C, and D as your correct answers. And so that's a bit about written questions. Finally, I hope that wasn't information overload. I just briefly want to touch on how we analyze statistically questions. So this is a whole realm of science, a whole realm of statistical science called item analysis, which if you're not interested in statistics is very boring, so I won't go into it too much. But there's 2 main measures that we use. So one of them is called the difficulty index, which is basically just the proportion, the percentage. If over 80% of your students are getting the question correct, it's not good assessment. And if less than 25% are getting it correct, that's also not good assessment. Either everyone's getting it right or nobody's getting it right. Of course, this is except if you're using the question as reinforcement, like I was talking at the beginning. Let's say you just want them all to recite their times tables. You're hoping for over 80% correct there. You're not trying to assess them, you're just trying to drill them. The discrimination index, I think, is so interesting. It's a slightly complicated formula, but it's basically how effective a question is at assessing students compared to each other and compared to the other questions on the test. But a negative index actually means the weaker students are more likely to get it correct by guessing. If you're interested, I've found a really good website where they explain it clearly and give you a quiz to try calculating these indices. So I've put a link there. Cool. So has anybody got any questions?
Thank you, Mina. If you have any questions, just either feel free to write them here. Let's try unmuting